I've always considered myself an experienced hiker, though not quite an expert. Over the past few decades, I've traversed countless trails across America, exploring over 3/4 of our national parks. But after a while, even the most breathtaking vistas can start to feel familiar. That's when I decided to shake things up a bit. My new approach was unconventional, to say the least. I began scouring Google Maps for vast, unnamed forests, seeking out the unexplored and untamed. It was a risky endeavor, sure, but the thrill of discovery was intoxicating. I developed a system to mitigate the danger of getting lost, a pack of homemade route marking stickers that I'd periodically attach to trees. As I passed each marker on my return journey, I'd remove them, leaving no trace behind. It was a foolproof method, or so I thought. This particular adventure led me to Dudley Town Forest in Connecticut. Now, I'm aware of the reputation this place holds. Abandoned since the 1800s, it's a hotbed for ghost stories and creepy legends. But I've never been one for superstition. To me, it was just another forest waiting to be explored. The drive from my home in New England wasn't too bad. I arrived at the forest's edge around noon, figuring I'd have plenty of daylight for my hike. As I stepped into the woods, the first thing that struck me was the silence. I'd heard rumors about the eerie quiet of Dudley Town Forest, but experiencing it firsthand was something else entirely. You don't truly appreciate the ambient sounds of nature until they're gone. The rustle of leaves, the chirping of birds, the scurrying of small animals, all absent. The silence was so complete that my own breathing seemed thunderous in comparison. It was unsettling, to say the least. I tried to shake off the unease as I began my hike, placing my stickers at regular intervals. The forest itself was beautiful in a stark, haunting way. Ancient trees stretched towards the sky, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the forest floor. The undergrowth was sparse, making it easy to navigate between the towering trunks. As I walked deeper into the forest, I kept expecting to encounter some sign of life, a bird call, a rustling in the bushes, anything. But the silence persisted, broken only by the sound of my footsteps and the occasional creak of a branch in the wind. After about an hour of hiking, I came across a small clearing. It seemed like a good place to take a break, so I sat down on a fallen log and pulled out my water bottle. As I sipped the cool liquid, I found myself straining to hear any sound other than my own. The silence was starting to get to me, playing tricks on my mind. More than once, I thought I heard something in the distance, only to realize it was just the blood rushing in my ears. I decided to press on, hoping to find some sign of animal life deeper in the forest. The terrain began to change as I walked, becoming more rugged and challenging. I had to watch my step carefully, navigating around jutting roots and over moss-covered rocks. It was during this more difficult part of the hike that I first heard it, a sound so out of place in the silent forest that it stopped me in my tracks. It was a kind of wailing, a drawn-out moan that seemed to echo through the trees. My first thought was that it must be a wounded animal, but something about the sound didn't quite fit. It was too sustained, too even in its pitch to be a natural cry of pain. I stood still, listening intently as the sound faded away. Part of me wanted to investigate, to find the source of the noise and satisfy my curiosity. But a stronger instinct told me to keep my distance. I continued on my original path, placing my markers with slightly shaky hands. As I hiked, my mind raced with possibilities. Could it have been the wind, somehow creating that eerie sound as it passed through the trees? But there was hardly any breeze to speak of. A hunter's call, perhaps? But who would be hunting in these abandoned woods, and what kind of call would make such an unsettling noise? I told myself that if I encountered one more strange occurrence, I'd turn back. It was a promise I should have kept. The wailing sound didn't return, but the silence that followed seemed even more oppressive. I found myself jumping at the smallest noises, the snap of a twig under my foot, the rustle of my backpack. The forest, which had seemed merely empty before, now felt actively hostile. It was in this state of heightened awareness that I noticed the carvings. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Surely those marks on the tree ahead were just random scratches, the result of normal forest wear and tear. But as I got closer, I realized they were deliberate. The tree's bark was covered in symbols, crude slashes and curves that didn't resemble any alphabet I knew. I looked around and saw that several neighboring trees bore similar markings. Some looked fresher than others, as if they'd been carved over a period of time. My heart was pounding now. This was it, the second strange occurrence I'd promised myself would be my cue to leave. I turned around, ready to retrace my steps and get out of this increasingly creepy forest. As I walked back along my trail, removing my markers as I went, I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was the work of other hikers, leaving their mark on the abandoned forest. Or perhaps it was something older, remnants of the town that had once stood here. Neither explanation felt satisfactory, but they were better than the alternatives my imagination was conjuring up. I'd been walking for about 20 minutes when I saw something that made my blood run cold. Ahead of me, nestled in the base of a large tree, was what looked like a cave entrance. It wasn't particularly large, more of a den than a cave, but it was unmistakably there. I froze, confusion giving way to fear as I realized the implications. I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that I hadn't passed this cave on my way in. I'm meticulous about noting landmarks, especially anything as significant as a cave. Which meant only one thing: I wasn't on the same path I'd taken into the forest. My eyes darted to the nearest trail marker, and I felt a wave of nausea as I realized it was lower than it should have been. The stickers I'd placed had been at shoulder height. These were barely above my waist. Someone, or something, had moved my markers. Panic surged through me. I spun around and started running back the way I'd come, no longer caring about stealth or leaving no trace. My only thought was to put as much distance between myself and that cave as possible. As I ran, questions raced through my mind. How had this happened? Had someone been following me the entire time, moving my markers as soon as I was out of sight? But I hadn't seen or heard anyone else in the forest. And how had they known which direction I'd be returning from? I didn't have time to puzzle it out. I was lost in a forest that was growing darker by the minute, with no idea which direction would lead me back to my car. I stopped running, gasping for breath, and pulled out my phone. By some miracle, I had a single bar of service. With shaking hands, I pulled up my map app and located my car. I wasn't as far off course as I'd feared, maybe a mile or so to the east of where I should have been. I memorized the direction I needed to go, knowing my signal could drop at any moment. Just as I pocketed my phone, the wailing started again. This time, it was louder, closer, and somehow more urgent. It seemed to be coming from all around me, as if the forest itself was crying out. I ran. I ran harder and faster than I ever had in my life, crashing through underbrush and leaping over fallen logs. The sound seemed to follow me, always just behind, no matter how fast I moved. Every few seconds, I'd risk a glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see some monstrous creature in pursuit. But there was never anything there, just the silent, empty forest and that terrible, unending wail. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I burst out of the tree lane. The wailing cut off abruptly, leaving me in blessed, terrifying silence. I didn't stop to catch my breath or look back. I sprinted to my car, fumbled with my keys, and peeled out of the parking area as fast as I dared on the rough road. It wasn't until I was miles away, safely on the highway, that I allowed myself to relax. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and my clothes were soaked with sweat. I felt drained, physically and emotionally, in a way I'd never experienced before. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to make sense of what had happened in Dudley Town Forest. The rational part of my brain insisted there had to be a logical explanation. Perhaps there was someone living in those woods, a recluse who didn't take kindly to intruders. They could have followed me, moving my markers to confuse me, using some kind of instrument to create that awful wailing sound. But there were holes in this theory that I couldn't ignore. How could anyone move so silently through the forest? How could they have predicted which way I'd go on my return journey? And that sound, I've never heard any instrument that could produce a noise like that, let alone one that could be played while running at full speed. I've since done more research on Dudley Town and its forest. The stories I dismissed as superstition before now seem less far-fetched. Tales of curse, of inexplicable phenomena, of people going missing, they all hit a little too close to home. I don't know what happened to me in those woods. I don't know if it was something natural or supernatural, human or something else. What I do know is that it changed me. I haven't been hiking since that day. The thought of entering any forest, let alone an unmapped one, fills me with a deep, primal fear. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, I think I can hear that wailing again, carried on the wind. It's probably just my imagination, my mind replaying the trauma of that day. But a part of me wonders, what if it isn't? What if whatever was in those woods is still out there, still calling? I don't have answers, only questions and a lingering sense of unease. All I can say for certain is this: there are places in this world that we don't understand, places that perhaps we're not meant to understand. Dudley Town Forest is one of those places. And if you value your peace of mind, I suggest you stay far, far away from it. As for me, I've hung up my hiking boots for good. Some trails are better left unexplored, some mysteries better left unsolved. The forests can keep their secrets. I'll stick to the safety of the beaten path from now on. Growing up, my childhood home was the perfect spot for hanging out with friends. There were a few reasons for this. My dad had an impressive man cave in the basement, complete with an almost endless supply of beer. My parents were pretty laid back, usually letting us drink down there and giving us our space. Our house sat on a large plot of land that bordered a decent-sized woods. If you walked through those woods from my place, you'd find yourself on a dirt road. Across that road was the reservoir, a place that had captured my heart since I was a kid. Over the years, I'd cut countless holes in the reservoir fence. I'd done it so many times that the Water Commission eventually gave up on repairing them. Technically, it was illegal for civilians to trespass on reservoir property, but as a teenager, I didn't care much about that. The reservoir was my sanctuary. I'd go there to smoke, to escape from my parents, to swim, to think. It was truly a beautiful place, and probably the only thing I genuinely miss from that chapter of my life. One summer evening, my friends and I were shooting pool in my basement, with some loud EDM music playing in the background. As the night wore on, my friend Chester suggested we take a hike through the woods to the reservoir. Boredom was starting to set in, so we all agreed. The sun hadn't set yet, so navigating wouldn't be too difficult. There were 5 of us that night: me, Chester, Rick, Jasper, and Hassan. If I remember correctly, Rick and Hassan grabbed some beers for the journey. They were the big drinkers in our group. I'd already had a few, so I decided to take it easy. The reservoir was huge, so even after crossing the fence, we still had quite a walk ahead of us. The recent rain had left the woods a bit muddy, but we were committed to our plan. There was a cliff on the near side where we usually hung out, so that's where we headed initially. After a while, though, we decided to keep walking and check out the far side of the reservoir. To get there, we had to walk along the near side to the end, then cut across to the other side. From there, we could walk along the far side until we reached a smooth section we called the beach. It took us about 20 minutes of walking before we finally reached the far side of the reservoir. That's when things started to get weird. Hassan suddenly raised his hand and pointed into the distance. We were on the far side of the oval-shaped reservoir but hadn't made it all the way down to the beach yet. Hassan was pointing to our right, where we could see something moving toward the reservoir on the same side we were on, albeit much further down. We all fell silent and watched as the dark figure slowly made its way towards the water. At first, we were kind of excited by this potential encounter. We usually welcomed a bit of adventure. But as the figure emerged from the woods and approached the water's edge, we realized they were dragging something. The closer they got, the more we could make out. Eventually, we realized what was being dragged: a large black garbage bag that clearly contained something heavy, judging by how slowly the person was moving. I don't want to jump to conclusions, But there had been a couple of bodies found in that reservoir over the years, so in that moment, we quickly assumed the worst. Our excitement vanished, replaced by a growing sense of dread. We weren't smiling or even talking anymore, just staring silently at the figure dragging what we guessed to be a body towards the water's edge. When they reached the water, the person knelt down over the bag for a few minutes. We couldn't really tell exactly what they were doing from so far away. We figured that was our cue to get out of there while they were distracted. But before we could leave, Chester spotted something else that stopped us in our tracks. 3 more figures emerged from the woods, 2 of them dragging bags. The third figure was carrying a kayak over his head. I started feeling sick to my stomach. We lived only 10 minutes from one of the most crime-ridden towns in America, so if this was somehow gang-related, it would have made a lot of sense. The first man we noticed got into the kayak, while the other 3 helped load one of the bags onto his lap. We watched in horror as he paddled out to the middle of the reservoir, and the garbage bag disappeared below the surface. He paddled back to the shore and repeated this process twice more. The whole scene felt surreal, like something out of a crime movie. And then, as if on cue, my phone rang. The annoying ringtone cut through the silence like a knife, and my nervous fingers couldn't mute it fast enough. The 4 men froze and turned to look in our direction. That's when we ran. Just like that, the sanctity of my backyard reservoir was shattered forever. Rick glanced over his shoulder and yelled that they were following us. It was the most terrifying moment of my life. Running in a forest is incredibly difficult, especially at night. Factor in the threat of death, and it becomes a nightmare. We sprinted all the way back down the bank, cut across, and started making our way through the woods on the near side, heading for the hole in the fence. I don't know if it was the nerves, the alcohol, or both, but I couldn't for the life of me remember where the damn hole was. I reached the fence first, with my friends close behind. They began to panic when they saw me tracing the fence aimlessly, searching frantically for a hole that could have been anywhere. We ran along the fence, and I was ready to give up when Rick pointed ahead of us and yelled. The hole was just a few feet away, and we bounded for it. As I was helping Chester through, we heard the sound of a tree branch snapping not far behind us. I knew they were closing in. The chase didn't end there. We ran through the woods all the way back to my backyard, finally feeling a sense of relief when we made it. Hassan immediately called the police. We told them what happened, and they said they'd send a squad car to my house right away. I knew I was going to get in trouble for trespassing, but at that point, I didn't care. My friends were relieved to be safe, but I couldn't shake my unease. The path from the reservoir to my house wasn't super far, and our pursuers could have easily followed the tracks we left on the trail. Eventually, the police arrived and listened to our story. They searched my property for any signs that we had been followed, and my stomach dropped when they actually found something. There was a set of muddy footprints that led to my backyard fence. I told the police they weren't ours, and when they asked if I was sure, I pointed out that we wouldn't have needed to jump our own fence. Thankfully, the police didn't find anyone hiding on my property, so they left and promised to keep me updated about the reservoir situation. To my surprise, they actually did follow up. After a few days, the police fished out 3 bodies from the reservoir. It wasn't a surprise given what we'd seen, but it became a huge news story for weeks. My parents and I were terrified for a long time, knowing that some dangerous criminals knew where we lived. For months afterward, my mom swore she saw people in the woods at night. She even claimed to have seen a camera flash one night. This incident was actually one of the main reasons we ended up moving out of that house. The fear and paranoia had become too much to bear. In the years that followed, I tried to put that night behind me, but it was always there in the back of my mind. I'd wake up in cold sweats, reliving the chase through the woods. I'd find myself scanning wooded areas nervously, always half expecting to see a dark figure dragging a heavy bag. I went to college out of state, partly to get away from the memories. But even there, I couldn't entirely escape. Whenever I'd hear about a missing person or an unsolved murder on the news, my mind would immediately go back to that night at the reservoir. I wondered how many other bodies might be hidden in its depths, how many other families were left without closure. After college, I moved back to my hometown, thinking enough time had passed. I got a job at a local newspaper, covering mostly mundane local events and human interest stories. But every now and then, a crime story would come across my desk, and I'd feel that familiar chill run down my spine. One day, about 5 years after the incident, I received an anonymous tip about some suspicious activity near the old reservoir. My editor wanted me to check it out, thinking it might make for an interesting story. I was hesitant, but I knew I couldn't let my personal fears get in the way of my job. As I drove out to the reservoir, memories came flooding back. The road hadn't changed much, and neither had the woods. I parked my car and walked toward the fence, my heart pounding in my chest. The old hole we used to use had long since been repaired, but it didn't take long to find a new one. I slipped through the fence, feeling like a teenager again, but this time with a press badge instead of a six-pack. The woods were quieter than I remembered, or maybe I was just more attuned to the sounds around me now. Every snapping twig made me jump. As I approached the water's edge, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, partially hidden by the reeds, was a black garbage bag. For a moment, I was paralyzed with fear, convinced I was about to relive that terrible night. But as I got closer, I realized the bag was empty, probably just some litter left behind by careless visitors. I let out a shaky laugh, feeling foolish for getting so worked up. But then I noticed something else, fresh tire tracks leading down to the water. I followed the tracks, my journalistic instincts overriding my fear. They led to a small clearing where I found several empty gas cans and some discarded rubber gloves. It could have been innocent, maybe someone had been filling up their boat, but something felt off. I took some photos and made some notes, then quickly made my way back to my car. As I was driving away, I saw a pickup truck heading towards the reservoir. The driver gave me a long, hard look as we passed each other. Back at the newspaper office, I started digging. I looked into recent missing persons reports, unsolved murders, anything that might connect to what I'd seen. I reached out to my old friends, Chester, Rick, Jasper, and Hassan, to see if they'd heard anything. Most of them had moved away, eager to leave the memories behind, but Rick still lived in town. We met up for coffee, and as soon as I mentioned the reservoir, I could see the color drain from his face. He told me he'd been hearing rumors about the place for years, stories of late-night activity, strange lights, and unexplained noises. He tried to ignore them, to convince himself it was just urban legends and overactive imaginations. But seeing my face, hearing about what I'd found, brought it all back. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into the investigation. I interviewed locals, pored over old police reports, and spent more time at the reservoir than I was comfortable with. Each visit left me feeling more uneasy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was onto something big. Then, one night as I was working late at the office, I received an anonymous email. The sender claimed to have information about what was really going on at the reservoir. They wanted to meet, but only on their terms, at night, at the old beach on the far side of the reservoir. Every instinct told me it was a bad idea, that I should turn the information over to the police and walk away. But I couldn't. Whether it was a sense of journalistic duty or a need for closure, I'm not sure. But I found myself agreeing to the meeting. The night of the meeting, I arrived at the reservoir well before the agreed time. I wanted to scope out the area, make sure I wasn't walking into an ambush. As I waited, hidden in the trees, I saw a figure approach the water's edge. My heart raced as I watched them drag something heavy towards the water. For a moment, I was that terrified teenager again, frozen in fear. But this time, I had a camera. I started taking pictures, my hands shaking so badly I wasn't sure they'd come out clearly. The figure must have heard the click of the camera because they suddenly stopped and looked in my direction. I held my breath, praying they hadn't seen me. After what felt like an eternity, they turned back to their task. I watched as they loaded whatever they were carrying into a small boat and paddled out into the reservoir. When they were far enough away, I crept down to where they had been standing. There, in the mud, I found a wallet. Inside was an ID. It belonged to a local businessman who had gone missing a week earlier. I knew I should call the police, but I also knew that if I did, whoever was behind this would disappear before they arrived. So I waited, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would give me away. When the boat returned, I was ready. As soon as the figure stepped onto the shore, I confronted them, my camera in one hand and my phone in the other, 911 already dialed. What happened next is still a blur. There was a struggle, a splash, and then darkness. When I came to, I was in the hospital. The police had found me unconscious by the reservoir, my camera smashed to pieces nearby. Of the figure in the boat, there was no sign. The investigation that followed turned our quiet town upside down. It uncovered a web of corruption and crime that went back decades, involving local businessmen, politicians, and even some law enforcement officers. The reservoir had been their dumping ground, their way of making problems disappear. As the story broke, I found myself in the spotlight. There were interviews, a book deal, even talk of a movie. But all I could think about was that night all those years ago, when 5 scared teenagers stumbled upon something they were never meant to see. In the end, some of those responsible were brought to justice, but many questions remained unanswered. The reservoir was drained, revealing more bodies than anyone had imagined. Each one represented a life cut short, a family left without closure. Today, the reservoir stands empty, a grim reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most peaceful-seeming places. The fence has been reinforced, cameras installed, but the damage has been done. The sanctuary of my youth is gone forever, replaced by a monument to human cruelty and corruption. As for me, I still live in town, still work at the newspaper. But I no longer cover crime stories. These days, I stick to local events and human interest pieces. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I find myself drawn to the old dirt road. I stand at the fence, looking out over the empty basin that was once filled with water, and I wonder about all the secrets it still holds. The woods are different now, too. Where once they held the promise of adventure, they now feel oppressive, as if the weight of all that happened there has bent the very trees. The laughter and carefree days of my youth seem like a distant dream, replaced by the harsh reality of what we uncovered. I often think about my friends from that night. We've all gone our separate ways, each of us dealing with the aftermath in our own way. Some, like Chester and Hassan, left town and never looked back. Others, like Rick and Jasper, stayed but were never quite the same. As for me, I'm still here, still trying to make sense of it all. I've become something of a local celebrity, though it's not a role I'm entirely comfortable with. People often ask me if I regret getting involved, if I wish I'd just walked away that night all those years ago. The truth is, I don't know. What we uncovered was terrible, the stuff of nightmares. But how many more lives might have been lost if we hadn't? How many more families would have been left wondering what happened to their loved ones? In the end, I suppose, that's the nature of truth. It's not always pretty, not always easy to face. But it's necessary. As a journalist, as a human being, I believe we have a responsibility to shine a light into the dark corners of our world, no matter how frightening it might be. So while the reservoir of my youth is gone, replaced by something far more sinister, I can't bring myself to regret what happened. Instead, I choose to remember the good times, the summer swims, the late night talks, the sense of freedom that came with having our own secret place. And if, sometimes, I wake in the night, haunted by memories of dark figures and heavy bags, well, that's a small price to pay for the truth. After all, some stories need to be told, some secrets need to be revealed, no matter how much we might wish to leave them buried in the depths of a quiet reservoir. My name is Matthew Mountain Bear, 27 years old, and this all went down on June 17, 1995. I've been a truck driver most of my adult life, hauling goods across this country from one coast to the other. It's a lonely job, but it pays the bills and gives me time to think. I like to joke that the cab of my truck is my office, my living room, and sometimes my bedroom all rolled into one. I remember that summer day like it was yesterday. I was headed to a small town in Arkansas, delivering a load of construction materials. The route took me through some back roads and lesser-known highways, places you wouldn't go unless you had a reason to be there. I liked those roads though. They were quiet, and the scenery was nice. About halfway through my trip, I pulled into a tiny gas station to fill up. The place looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s, and the old man behind the counter fit right in with the decor. He was friendly enough, and we chatted for a bit about the weather and how the Razorbacks were doing that season. As I was paying, I noticed a bulletin board covered with missing person flyers. Small towns always seem to have more of those. I asked the old man about it, nodding towards the board. "More often than you'd think," he replied, his eyes darkening a bit. "Best to stick to the main roads and keep to yourself, son." I thanked him for the advice, filled up my thermos with coffee, and got back on the road. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the fields and trees. I flipped on the radio and found some old rock station, cranking it up to keep myself awake. A couple of hours later, my eyelids were getting heavy, and I figured it was time to pull over for a nap. I found a little pull-off area just past a dense patch of forest. It wasn't an official rest stop, but it looked good enough. I parked the truck, locked the doors, and climbed into the sleeper cab. It didn't take long for me to doze off. I woke up to a sound that was out of place. At first, I thought it was just an animal rustling around outside, but then I heard it again. It was a thump followed by a dragging noise. I sat up, my heart pounding, and listened. There it was again, thump, drag. It was coming from the back of the truck. I grabbed a flashlight and my tire iron, telling myself it was probably nothing. Maybe a branch had fallen or some critter was trying to get into the cargo. I unlocked the door and stepped out into the cool night air. The moon was full, giving me just enough light to see by without the flashlight. I walked around to the back of the truck, my grip tight on the tire iron. As I got closer, I could hear something moving inside the trailer. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. I unlocked the latch and slowly lifted the door. The smell hit me first. It was the sickly sweet stench of decay. I gagged, stepping back and shining the flashlight inside. There, among the neatly stacked pallets of construction materials, was a body. A woman, from what I could tell, though she was so badly decomposed it was hard to be sure. She was wrapped in plastic, like some kind of macabre gift. Panic surged through me, and I dropped the flashlight. It clattered to the ground, casting wild shadows as it rolled. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. Who was she? How did she get in my truck? And more importantly, who put her there? I scrambled back into the cab, locking the doors behind me. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the keys in the ignition. I started the engine and tore out of there, not caring about speed limits or potholes. My mind was a blur of fear and confusion. I needed to find a phone and call the cops, but I had no idea where the nearest town was. After what felt like hours of driving, I saw the glow of lights up ahead. It was a diner, one of those 24-hour places that cater to truckers and night owls. I pulled into the parking lot, my tires screeching. I ran inside, my eyes darting around wildly. The waitress behind the counter looked up, startled. "You okay, hon?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. "I need to use your phone," I panted. "It's an emergency." She pointed to a payphone on the wall, and I fumbled for change, finally managing to dial 911. My heart pounded as I explained what I'd found, stumbling over my words in my haste. The operator's voice was calm and steady. "Stay where you are, sir. We're sending someone out to you right now. Do not leave the location." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me, and hung up. The waitress came over with a cup of coffee. "On the house," she said softly. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I took the coffee, my hands still shaking, and sat down at a booth. The place was nearly empty, just a couple of truckers at the counter and an old man nursing a bowl of soup in the corner. The minutes stretched unlike hours as I waited for the cops to arrive. When they finally did, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. 2 officers walked in, looking around before spotting me. I stood up and waved them over. "You're the one who called?" one of them asked, a tall guy with a stern face. "Yeah, that's me," I replied. "Ezra Tate. My truck's up front." They followed me outside, and I led them to the back of the truck. The smell hit us again as I lifted the door, and the officers exchanged a grim look. They called for backup and started asking me questions. Where I'd been, if I'd seen anyone around, if I had any idea who the woman was. I answered as best I could, but I was just as clueless as they were. While we waited for the detectives to arrive, I sat on the curb, staring at the asphalt. The other officer, a younger guy, stayed with me, trying to keep me calm. "These things happen," he said, though it didn't feel very reassuring. The detectives showed up a little while later and started processing the scene. They took my statement again, this time in more detail. I told them about the gas station and the old man's warning. One of the detectives, a woman with sharp eyes, asked if I remembered anything unusual about the people I had seen there. "Not really," I said. "It was just the old man and a couple of other drivers. Nothing seemed off." She nodded and made a note in her book. "We'll be in touch, Mr. Tate. You're free to go for now, but don't leave town." I nodded, feeling a strange mix of relief and dread. I got back in my truck and drove to the nearest motel, where I finally collapsed into bed. Sleep didn't come easy, and when it did, it was filled with nightmares. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I'd been hit by a truck myself. I checked out and went to a diner across the street for breakfast. I was halfway through my eggs when the detective from last night walked in. She spotted me and came over. "Mind if I join you?" she asked. I shook my head, and she sat down across from me. "We identified the woman," she said, getting straight to the point. Her name was Linda Pierce. She'd been missing for about a month. Last seen in Little Rock. I felt a chill run down my spine. "How did she end up in my truck?" I asked. "That's what we're trying to figure out," she said. "We think she was dead before she was put there. The plastic wrapping suggests whoever did it wanted to keep the smell contained for as long as possible." "Jesus," I muttered, pushing my plate away. "Do you think it was one of the other drivers? Someone at that gas station?" "It's possible," she said. "We're looking into it. In the meantime, I'd suggest you be careful. Whoever did this might not be done." Her words stayed with me long after she left. I finished my coffee and paid the bill, then headed back to my truck. I had deliveries to make, and I couldn't afford to sit around waiting for answers. As I drove, I kept an eye on the road, checking my mirrors more often than usual. Every car that passed made me tense up, wondering if it was the killer. Over the next few days, the fear started to fade, replaced by a sense of determination. I wasn't going to let some psycho scare me off the road. I kept driving, kept doing my job, but I was more vigilant. I checked my truck thoroughly every time I stopped, making sure no one had tampered with it. A week later, I got a call from the detective. They'd found the guy, a drifter who'd been hanging around truck stops and rest areas. He had a record for assault and had been spotted in Little Rock around the time Linda went missing. They caught him trying to hitch a ride out of state. I felt a wave of relief, but it was mixed with anger. I wanted to know why he'd done it, why he'd chosen my truck, but I knew I'd probably never get those answers. The detective told me to stay in touch and let her know if I remembered anything else, but for now, the case was closed. Life went back to normal, or as normal as it could be. I kept driving, kept hauling goods across the country, but that experience changed me. I was more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. I still loved the open road, but the shadows seemed a little darker, the quiet nights a little more unsettling. Every now and then, I'd think about Linda Pierce and wonder what her life had been like, who she'd been. I never found out much more about her, just that she was another victim in a long list of people who'd met a tragic end. But I kept going, because that's what you do. You keep moving forward, no matter what. And so, I'm still out here, driving my routes, doing my job. The road is my home, and I've learned to live with the ghosts that ride along with me. It's not always easy, But it's the life I know, and it's the life I've chosen. The years rolled on, and I kept driving. The incident with Linda Pierce faded into the background, but it never really left me. It was always there, like a scar that you forget about until you catch a glimpse of it in the mirror. I became known as a reliable driver, someone who always delivered on time and never caused any trouble. But I also gained a reputation for being a bit of a loner, someone who kept to himself and didn't socialize much at truck stops or diners. I preferred it that way. The less people knew about me, the better. I'd seen firsthand how quickly life could turn upside down, how easily you could get caught up in something you never asked for. So I kept my head down and did my job. One day, about 5 years after the incident, I was making a run from Chicago to Houston. It was a long haul, and I was looking forward to getting it over with. I'd been on the road for about 12 hours when I decided to pull over at a rest stop in Missouri. It was late, past midnight, and the place was nearly deserted. I parked my truck and headed to the vending machines to grab a snack. As I was feeding my dollar bills into the machine, I heard a commotion coming from the far end of the parking lot. I turned to see a woman struggling with a man near a beat-up old sedan. My first instinct was to mind my own business, but something about the scene didn't sit right with me. I hesitated for a moment, then started walking towards them. As I got closer, I could hear the woman pleading. "Please, just let me go. I won't tell anyone, I swear." The man had her by the arm, trying to force her into the car. "Hey," I called out, my voice echoing across the empty lot. "Is everything okay over there?" The man's head snapped up, his eyes meeting mine. For a split second, nobody moved. Then, in a blur of motion, he shoved the woman to the ground and took off running towards the woods that bordered the rest stop. The woman scrambled to her feet and ran towards me, tears streaming down her face. "Are you all right?" I asked, my heart pounding. She nodded, unable to speak through her sobs. I led her back to my truck, where I kept a first aid kit. As I cleaned up a scrape on her arm, she told me her story. Her name was Maria, and she'd been hitchhiking her way across the country. The man had picked her up a few hours ago, promising to take her as far as St. Louis. But he started acting weird, she said, her voice shaky. He wouldn't let me out when I asked. He said he had plans for me. A chill ran down my spine as I remembered Linda Pierce. Could this be the same guy? No, I told myself. They caught that bastard. This was just another creep, another predator looking for easy prey. I called the police, and they arrived about 20 minutes later. They took Maria's statement and mine, then started searching the area for the man. They didn't find him, of course. He was long gone by then. The officers offered to take Maria to a shelter in the nearest town, but she was reluctant to go. "I don't know anyone there," she said, looking lost and scared. I found myself speaking before I'd even really thought it through. "I'm headed to Houston," I said. "If you want, I can give you a ride that far. It's not much, but it's something." The officers looked at me suspiciously, but Maria's face lit up. "Really? You'd do that?" And that's how I ended up with a passenger for the first time in my career. We set off as the sun was coming up, the highway stretching out before us like a promise. Maria was quiet at first, still shaken from her ordeal. But as the miles rolled by, she started to open up. She told me about her life back in Michigan, about the dreams that had led her to hit the road, about the reality that had come crashing down on her. I found myself talking too, more than I had in years. I told her about my life on the road, about the good days and the bad. I even told her about Linda Pierce, though I left out some of the more gruesome details. Maria listened with wide eyes, hanging on every word. "You're like a guardian angel," she said when I finished. "You saved me, just like you tried to save her." I shook my head. "I'm no angel," I said. "Just a guy who's seen enough bad stuff to know when to step in." We fell into a comfortable silence after that, the hum of the engine and the sound of the tires on the asphalt filling the cab. We made it to Houston without incident, and I dropped Maria off at a women's shelter downtown. She hugged me before she left, thanking me again for everything. "Be careful out there," I told her. "The world can be a dangerous place." She nodded, a determined look in her eyes. "I will," she said. "And I'll never forget what you did for me." As I watched her walk into the shelter, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Maybe, just maybe, I'd made a difference. Maybe I'd helped balance the scales a little bit, added a touch of good to offset all the bad I'd seen. I got back in my truck and headed out to make my delivery. The road stretched out before me, familiar and unknown all at once. I didn't know what the future held, what other stories were waiting to unfold on this endless ribbon of asphalt. But for the first time in a long time, I was looking forward to finding out. The years continued to pass, and I kept driving. The incident with Maria had changed something in me. I was still cautious, still kept to myself most of the time, but I found myself paying more attention to the people around me. I started noticing things: a woman with a bruised arm at a truck stop, a kid who looked too young to be hitchhiking, an old man who seemed lost and confused at a rest area. Sometimes I stepped in, offered help where I could. Other times, I called the authorities if something seemed really off. I wasn't trying to be a hero or anything, just doing what I thought was right. But word started to spread. Other drivers began to talk about me, about the guy who was always willing to lend a hand or keep an eye out for trouble. One night, about 10 years after I'd found Linda Pierce, I was at a diner in Nebraska. It was late, and the place was mostly empty. I was nursing a cup of coffee when a young woman slid into the booth across from me. She couldn't have been more than 25, with tired eyes and a haunted look that I recognized all too well. "Are you Matthew?" she asked. I nodded, wary. "I heard about you," she said. "They say you help people. That you understand." I didn't say anything, just waited for her to continue. She took a deep breath. "My sister went missing 3 months ago. The police haven't found anything. They say she probably just ran off, but I know she wouldn't do that. Not without telling me." I listened as she poured out her story. Her sister, Kat, had been working as a waitress at a truck stop near Omaha. She disappeared after her shift one night, her car still in the parking lot. The police had investigated, but they hadn't found much. No signs of struggle, no witnesses, nothing. "I've been driving around, talking to anyone who might have seen her," the young woman said. "Her name was Amy. But I'm running out of leads and money. I don't know what else to do." I sighed, feeling the weight of her desperation. "I'm not a detective," I said gently. "I'm just a truck driver." "But you've seen things," Amy insisted. "You might notice something the police missed. Please, I'm not asking you to solve it. Just keep an eye out. Let me know if you hear anything." I thought about it for a long moment. I knew getting involved could be dangerous. I'd seen enough to know that. But I also remembered how it felt to be helpless, to have questions with no answers. "All right," I said finally. "I'll keep my ears open. But I can't promise anything." Amy's face lit up with relief. She pulled out a photo of her sister and handed it to me. Kat had a bright smile and kind eyes. It was the kind of photo that made you wonder how anyone could hurt her. Over the next few months, I asked around whenever I stopped at truck stops or diners. Most people hadn't seen or heard anything, but every now and then, I'd get a lead. Someone who thought they might have seen Kat at a gas station in Colorado. A trucker who remembered giving a ride to a girl matching her description. I passed everything on to Amy, who followed up on each lead with dogged determination. Most of them turned out to be dead ends, but she never gave up hope. Then, about 6 months after I'd met Amy, I was making a delivery in Wyoming. I stopped at a small diner for lunch, and as I was waiting for my food, I overheard a conversation at the next table. 2 men were talking, their voices low but excited. "Telling you, man, it's a gold mine. These girls, they got nowhere to go, no one looking for them. We pick them up, move them around, no one's the wiser." I felt my blood run cold. I couldn't be sure they were talking about what I thought they were talking about, but my gut told me this was bad news. I pretended to be engrossed in my phone, straining to hear more. Yeah, but what about that last one? The waitress from Nebraska. Her sister's been snooping around. My heart nearly stopped. They had to be talking about Kat. I forced myself to stay calm, to keep listening. They mentioned a warehouse outside of Cheyenne, said something about moving the merchandise soon. As soon as they left, I called Amy. I think I've found something, I told her. But we need to call the police. This is bigger than us. What happened next was a blur. The FBI got involved. There were raids, arrests. It turned out to be a large human trafficking ring, operating across several states. They found Kat, along with several other missing women. She was alive, but traumatized. It would take her a long time to recover. Amy called me the day after they rescued Kat. She was crying, but they were tears of joy and relief. "Thank you," she kept saying. "Thank you for not giving up." I felt a mix of emotions, relief that Kat was safe, anger at the men who had taken her, and a deep, bone-weary sadness for all the women who hadn't been as lucky. But underneath it all was a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in a long time. I kept driving after that, kept doing my job. But I also kept my eyes open, kept listening. I became a point of contact for families of missing persons, a conduit of information between the road and the authorities. It wasn't always easy, and there were plenty of times when I couldn't help, when the trail went cold and the questions remained unanswered. But every now and then, I'd get a call or a letter. Someone found, someone saved. A family reunited. And in those moments, I'd think back to that night in Arkansas, to Linda Pierce and the dark turn my life had taken. I'd think about how sometimes, the worst moments of our lives can lead us to our true purpose. I'm getting older now. The long hours on the road are starting to take their toll. But I'm not ready to give it up just yet. There are still stories out there, still people who need help. And as long as I'm able, I'll keep driving, keep watching, keep listening. Because out here on the road, in the quiet moments between towns and truck stops, there are secrets waiting to be uncovered. And sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to listen, to make a difference. I've always considered myself a city person. The hustle and bustle of urban life, the convenience of having everything at your fingertips, and the constant flow of people, that's what I was used to. But life has a way of throwing curveballs, and mine came in the form of a job transfer to a small town on the outskirts of a vast forest. At first, I was hesitant. The idea of living so close to nature, away from the comfort of city lights and 24-hour convenience stores, was unsettling. But as a single father to my 10-year-old daughter, Lily, I knew this could be an opportunity for a fresh start and a chance to spend more quality time with her. We moved into a quaint house with a spacious backyard that bordered the forest. The real estate agent had sold it to us as a feature, talking about the beauty of nature and the peace it would bring. Little did I know that this proximity to the woods would lead to the most terrifying experience of my life. Lily, being the adventurous spirit she is, took to our new surroundings like a fish to water. She was fascinated by the trees, the birds, and the idea of exploring the great outdoors. It wasn't long before she started pestering me about going camping. "Dad, please. Can we go camping?" "Pretty please," she'd ask, her eyes wide with excitement. I'd always laugh it off, saying, "Maybe next weekend, sweetie." But the truth was, I simply didn't see the appeal. The idea of sleeping on the hard ground, battling mosquitoes, and being away from modern comforts didn't exactly scream fun to me. But Lily was persistent. Every day, she'd come up with a new reason why we should go camping. She'd show me pictures from her school books of happy families gathered around campfires, telling stories and roasting marshmallows. She'd talk about her classmates' camping adventures, her voice tinged with longing. As the weeks passed, I found myself running out of excuses. I realized that while camping might not be my idea of a good time, it clearly meant the world to Lily. And isn't that what being a parent is all about? stepping out of your comfort zone for the sake of your child's happiness. So, one Friday evening, after a particularly long week at work, I made a decision that would change our lives forever. "Hey, Lily," I called out as I entered our home. "How would you like to go camping this weekend?" The look of pure joy on her face made any hesitation I had melt away. She squealed with delight, jumping up and down, her pigtails bouncing with each hop. "Really, Dad? You mean it? We're really going camping?" I nodded, a smile spreading across my face despite my reservations. "Yes, sweetie. But let's start small, okay? How about we camp in our backyard this time?" Lily's excitement didn't diminish one bit at the suggestion. If anything, she seemed even more thrilled at the idea of transforming our own backyard into a campsite. "That's even better, Dad. We can practice for when we go to a real campsite." "Oh, this is going to be so much fun." Her enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself getting caught up in her excitement. We spent the rest of the evening planning our camping trip, making lists of what we'd need, and discussing what activities we could do. As Lily chatted away about ghost stories and stargazing, I couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation building. Maybe this camping thing wouldn't be so bad after all. Maybe, just maybe, I'd been missing out on something special all these years. Little did I know that our innocent backyard camping adventure would turn into a night of unimaginable terror, one that would haunt me for years to come. The next morning, we woke up early, both of us buzzing with excitement. Lily could hardly contain herself as we ate breakfast, her words tumbling out between bites of cereal. "Dad, can we set up the tent now? Oh, and can we make a campfire? And roast marshmallows? And tell scary stories?" I chuckled, her enthusiasm warming my heart. "Slow down, sweetheart. We have all day to set everything up. Let's start with the tent, okay?" After breakfast, we headed to the garage where I'd stored the camping gear I'd bought years ago, thinking I might one day use it. The tent was still in its original packaging, never opened. As I pulled it out, a cloud of dust rose, making us both cough and laugh. "Looks like this tent has been waiting for us for a long time," I said, brushing off the dust. Lily giggled. "It's okay, Dad. We're going to give it a great first adventure." We spent the next few hours setting up our campsite in the backyard. Our yard wasn't huge, but it was big enough for our purposes. The grass was a little overgrown, adding to the wilderness feel, as Lily put it. At the far end, a wooden fence separated our property from the dense forest beyond. Setting up the tent proved to be more of a challenge than I anticipated. The instructions were vague at best, and more than once, I found myself tangled in tent poles and canvas. Lily found this hilarious, of course, and her laughter echoed through the yard as she watched me struggle. "Dad, you look like a pretzel," she giggled as I tried to untangle myself from a particularly stubborn tent pole. I couldn't help but laugh along with her. "Well, how about you come help your pretzel dad, then?" Together, we managed to get the tent up. It wasn't perfect, one side sagged a bit, and I wasn't entirely sure we'd used all the pegs correctly, but it was standing, and that was good enough for us. "It's perfect, Dad," Lily declared, beaming with pride at our accomplishment. Next came the sleeping bags. We unrolled them inside the tent, creating our cozy sleeping area. Lily insisted on arranging and rearranging the inside of the tent, making sure everything was just right. As the afternoon wore on, we tackled our next challenge, the campfire. Our backyard had a small fire pit that the previous owners had installed, which was perfect for our needs. Lily helped me gather small twigs and branches from around the yard for kindling, while I brought out some firewood I'd bought from the local hardware store. "Now, remember, Lily," I said as we arranged the wood in the pit, "fire can be very dangerous. You must never try to start a fire on your own, okay?" She nodded solemnly. "I promise, Dad. I'll always wait for you." I smiled, proud of her maturity. "That's my girl. Now, want to see how to start a fire?" Her eyes lit up. "Yes, please." I showed her how to arrange the kindling in larger pieces of wood, explaining each step as I went. Then, with a flick of a match, our campfire came to life. The flames danced merrily, casting a warm glow as the sun began to set. Lily clapped her hands in delight. "We did it, Dad. We made a real campfire." As dusk settled in, our backyard was transformed. The flickering firelight cast long shadows, and the chirping of crickets filled the air. It felt like we were miles away from civilization, not just steps from our back door. We roasted hot dogs over the fire for dinner, followed by the obligatory marshmallows for dessert. Lily's face was a sticky mess of melted marshmallow and chocolate, but her smile was brighter than I'd seen in a long time. As we sat by the fire, bellies full and hearts content, Lily snuggled up next to me. "This is the best day ever, Dad," she said softly. "Thank you for doing this with me." I wrapped my arm around her, feeling a lump form in my throat. "You're welcome, sweetie. I'm glad we did this too." As the night deepened, we told stories by the firelight. Lily regaled me with tales from school and her own imaginative stories about magical forests and talking animals. I shared some of my childhood memories, carefully edited to be kid-friendly, of course. Eventually, Lily's eyelids began to droop, and I knew it was time to call it a night. "All right, camper," I said, ruffling her hair. "Time to hit the sack." We doused the fire, making sure it was completely out before heading to our tent. As we zipped ourselves into our sleeping bags, I couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. We'd done it. We'd gone camping, even if it was just in our backyard. "Good night, Dad," Lily mumbled, already half asleep. "Love you." "Love you too, sweetheart," I whispered back. As I lay there in the darkness, listening to Lily's steady breathing and the night sounds around us, I felt a deep sense of peace. The worries of work, bills, and everyday life seemed far away. For the first time in a long while, I felt truly relaxed. Little did I know that this sense of peace was about to be shattered in the most terrifying way possible. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a sound. At first, I couldn't place it. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, a cross between a screech and a low, guttural growl. My heart began to race as I strained my ears, trying to determine where the sound was coming from. It seemed to be coming from the woods beyond our fence, but it was hard to tell for sure. I glanced over at Lily, relieved to see she was still fast asleep, oblivious to the unsettling noise. I didn't want to wake her and cause unnecessary fear if it turned out to be nothing. Slowly, carefully, I unzipped my sleeping bag and crawled to the tent entrance. The sound came again, louder this time. It sent chills down my spine. Whatever was making that noise, it wasn't any animal I was familiar with. I unzipped the tent flap just enough to peer out. The backyard was bathed in silvery moonlight, casting eerie shadows across the grass. Everything seemed still, peaceful even. But then I saw it. At the far end of the yard, near the fence bordering the forest, something moved. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. It looked like a shadow, darker than the surrounding night, shifting and undulating in a way that defied natural movement. I blinked hard, sure that when I opened my eyes again, the strange shape would be gone. But it wasn't. If anything, it seemed more defined now. As I watched, frozen in a mixture of fear and disbelief, the shape began to move. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs too long and jointed in all the wrong places. It moved with a fluid grace that was both mesmerizing and terrifying. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was this some kind of elaborate prank? A hallucination brought on by too many campfire stories? But deep down, I knew. This was real, and it was unlike anything I'd ever encountered before. The creature, for lack of a better word, seemed to be pacing along the fence line. Its movements were purposeful, almost as if it was patrolling. Every so often, it would stop and turn its head towards our tent. I couldn't make out any features in the darkness, but I had the unsettling feeling that it was aware of our presence. I wanted to retreat back into the tent, to wake Lily and make a run for the house. but I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or even call out. All I could do was watch in horrified fascination as this impossible being moved through our backyard. Suddenly, the creature stopped. It turned fully towards our tent, and I felt my blood run cold. Even though I couldn't see its eyes, I knew with absolute certainty that it was looking directly at me. For what felt like an eternity, we stayed like that, me, peering out from the relative safety of the tent, and this otherworldly being, standing motionless in the moonlight. The night seemed to hold its breath, the usual sounds of crickets and distant traffic completely silenced. Then, without warning, the creature moved. It took a step towards our tent, its movement so fluid it seemed to glide across the grass. That was all it took to break me out of my paralysis. I scrambled backward, zipping the tent flap closed as quietly as I could with shaking hands. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure it would wake Lily. But she slept on, blissfully unaware of the terror just outside. I crawled back to my sleeping bag, my mind racing. What should I do? Should I wake Lily and make a run for it? But what if sudden movement attracted the creature's attention? Should I call for help? But who would believe me if I described what I'd seen? As I lay there, every muscle tense, straining my ears for any sound of approach, a new noise cut through the silence. It was a scratching sound, like claws or long nails dragging across the fabric of the tent. I held my breath, my eyes wide in the darkness. The scratching continued, moving slowly around the perimeter of the tent. It was as if the creature was testing, searching for a way in. I reached out and grasped Lily's hand, ready to shake her awake at a moment's notice. But still, I hesitated. As long as the creature remained outside, maybe it was better to let her sleep through this nightmare. The scratching stopped at the tent entrance. I could hear something breathing heavily just on the other side of the thin fabric barrier. It was a wet, raspy sound that sent shivers down my spine. Then, slowly, the zipper of the tent began to move. In that moment, survival instinct took over. I shook Lily awake, clamping my hand over her mouth to stifle any noise she might make. Her eyes flew open, filled with confusion and fear as she saw the panic on my face. I put a finger to my lips, signaling her to be quiet, then pointed to the tent entrance. Lily's eyes widened as she saw the zipper slowly, inexorably, being pulled up. She clutched my arm, trembling. I had to make a decision. We couldn't stay here, trapped like animals in a cage. Our only hope was to make a run for the house. It was risky, but it was our only chance. I leaned close to Lily's ear and whispered as quietly as I could, "When I say go, run to the house as fast as you can. Don't look back. Just run. Okay?" She nodded, her face pale in the dim light. The zipper was almost at the top now. I tensed, ready to spring into action. Just as I saw a long, pale hand begin to push through the opening, I shouted, "Go!" We burst out of the tent, catching the creature by surprise. In the split second I allowed myself to look, I saw it recoil, momentarily stunned by our sudden appearance. Lily was ahead of me, running full tilt towards the house. I was right behind her, my heart pounding in my ears. I could hear the creature recovering, its unnatural movements rustling through the grass behind us. We reached the back door, and I fumbled with the keys, my hand shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the lock. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The creature was crossing the yard with impossible speed, its long limbs eating up the distance between us. In the full moonlight, I could see it clearly for the first time, and the sight nearly stopped my heart. It was vaguely humanoid, but that's where any resemblance to humanity ended. Its skin was a sickly pale color, stretched tight over an emaciated frame. Its arms and legs were too long, jointed in ways that defied anatomy. But it was the face that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. Where there should have been eyes, there were only dark, empty sockets. Its mouth was a gaping maw filled with needle-sharp teeth. As it ran, it let out that terrible screeching growl I'd heard earlier. Just as the creature reached out with its long, clawed hands, I managed to get the door open. We tumbled inside, and I slammed the door shut, locking it immediately. Lily was crying now, the fear and confusion finally overwhelming her. I scooped her up in my arms, holding her close as I ran through the house, closing and locking every door and window. We ended up in my bedroom, huddled together on the bed. I could hear the creature outside, circling the house, occasionally scratching at the walls or windows. Lily buried her face in my chest, her small body shaking with sobs. "It's okay, sweetheart," I murmured, stroking her hair. "We're safe now. It can't get in." But even as I said the words, I wasn't sure I believed them. What was this thing? How could something like this exist? And most importantly, what did it want? We stayed like that for hours, jumping at every sound, every shadow. I kept expecting the creature to burst through a window or somehow find its way inside. But as the night wore on, the sounds outside began to fade. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the curtains, I realized the night had gone quiet. No more scratching, no more of that terrible screeching growl. Had it gone? Lily had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep, but I couldn't bring myself to close my eyes. I gently laid her down on the bed and, steeling my nerves, went to the window. Slowly, carefully, I pulled back the curtain just enough to peer out. The backyard was bathed in the soft light of early morning. Everything looked normal. The tent was still there, though it had collapsed at some point during the night. There was no sign of the creature. I let out a shaky breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Had it all been a terrible nightmare? But no, the fear had been too real, too visceral. And Lily had seen it too. I spent the next hour checking every room in the house, looking for any sign of intrusion. Everything was as we'd left it. Finally, I allowed myself to relax, just a little. When Lily woke up, her first words were, "Dad, was that real? Did that really happen?" I sat down next to her on the bed, pulling her close. "Yes, sweetie, it was real. But we're safe now. It's gone." She looked up at me, her eyes wide. "What was it, Dad?" I shook my head. "I don't know, Lily. I've never seen anything like it before." We spent the rest of the day inside, both of us too shaken to venture out. I called in sick to work, and Lily stayed home from school. We tried to distract ourselves with movies and games, but the events of the night hung over us like a dark cloud. That evening, as I was making dinner, I heard Lily call out from the living room. "Dad, come quick." I rushed in, fearing the worst, but Lily was just pointing at the TV. The local news was on, and the headline made my blood run cold: "Strange creature sighted in local woods." The reporter was talking about multiple sightings of an unidentified creature in the forest bordering our town. The descriptions matched what we had seen: unnaturally tall, pale skin, long limbs. Some people had managed to capture blurry photos or shaky video footage. As we watched, a wildlife expert came on, trying to explain away the sightings as a bear or some other large animal. But I knew better. We knew better. Over the next few weeks, the sightings continued. More and more people came forward with stories similar to ours. The town was in a state of fear and excitement. News fans from bigger cities started showing up, and there was talk of calling in state or even federal authorities to investigate. Lily and I never went camping in the backyard again. In fact, we rarely ventured into the backyard at all, especially after dark. But sometimes, late at night, I would hear that familiar scratching sound outside, or catch a glimpse of something tall and pale moving at the edge of the woods. We thought about moving, but where would we go? If this creature, or others like it, were out there, was anywhere truly safe? Months passed, and gradually, life in our town started to return to normal. The sightings became less frequent, the news crews packed up and left, and people began to dismiss the whole thing as mass hysteria or an elaborate hoax. But Lily and I knew the truth. We had seen it with our own eyes, heard it with our own ears. And we knew that somewhere out there, in the darkness of the forest, it was still waiting. One evening, about a year after our encounter, Lily came to me with a serious look on her face. "Dad," she said, "I think we need to go camping again." I was shocked. "Lily, after what happened, are you sure?" She nodded firmly. "I'm sure, Dad. We can't let fear control us forever. Plus, I've been doing research. I think I know what that thing was, and I think I know how to protect ourselves from it." I listened as she explained her theories, a mix of folklore, cryptozoology, and good old-fashioned survival skills. I had to admit, she'd put a lot of thought into this. "All right," I said finally. "We'll do it. But we're going to prepare. And we're going to be careful." Over the next few months, we planned. We researched. We trained. We learned about tracking, about wilderness survival, about the legends and myths of creatures that lurk in the shadows. And finally, on a crisp autumn evening, we packed up our gear and headed into the woods. Not our backyard this time, but the real thing. As we hiked deeper into the forest, I felt a mixture of fear and excitement. I knew the creature might be out there, watching, waiting. But this time, we were ready. As we set up our campsite, I realized something had changed. The forest no longer seemed like a place of terror, but a place of mystery and adventure. Yes, there were dangers out there, things beyond our understanding. But there was also beauty and wonder in the thrill of discovery. That night, as Lily and I sat by our campfire, telling stories and roasting marshmallows, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. We had faced our fears, confronted the unknown, and come out stronger for it. And if that creature, or anything else, decided to pay us a visit, well, this time, we'd be ready. As I looked across the fire at Lily, her face glowing in the firelight, I saw not just my little girl, but a brave, curious, resilient young woman. Whatever challenges life might throw at us, whatever strange and terrifying things might be lurking in the shadows, I knew we could face them together. And so, dear listener, that's my story. A tale of terror, yes, but also a tale of growth, of facing fears, and of the unbreakable bond between a father and daughter. Remember, the next time you're in the woods and you hear a strange sound or see a shadow move in a way it shouldn't, it might not be your imagination. But don't let that stop you from exploring, from seeking adventure. Just be prepared, be brave, and always keep your loved ones close. For in the end, it's not the monsters in the dark that define us, but how we face them. And who we face them with.